He just wanted to hit the heavy bag for 30 minutes. Nothing fancy, nothing complicated. Just an old man trying to stay in shape at 68. But the young fighters laughed at his slow movements, mocked his gray hair, and told him to find a senior center instead. What they didn't know was that this old man had trained Marines for 20 years, and exactly 1 hour later, his former students walked through that door. Welcome to Mysterious Human Stories. Before we dive into this powerful tale of respect, brotherhood, and instant karma, tell me in the comments, from which city around the world are you watching today? And if you believe stories about real warriors deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These moments change everything. Sal's boxing gym sat in the industrial part of town, wedged between a tire shop and a 24-hour laundromat. It wasn't fancy, just concrete floors, fluorescent lights that flickered occasionally, and the smell of sweat that had soaked into the walls over 30 years. The heavy bags hung from rusted chains, the speed bags rattled with each punch, and the ring in the center had seen more blood than most emergency rooms. It was 6 p.m. on a Tuesday when Frank Martinez pushed through the glass door. 68 years old, wearing faded gym shorts, a Marine Corps t-shirt that had seen better days, and boxing gloves that were older than most of the fighters in the gym. His gray hair was combed back, his mustache neatly trimmed, and his posture straight despite the arthritis that reminded him every morning that his body had been through wars. The gym was busy. Young fighters were training for upcoming matches, college kids were working off stress, and a few wannabe tough guys were trying to impress girlfriends with their power punches. Frank walked quietly to an empty heavy bag in the corner, hung up his small duffel bag, and began stretching. Nobody paid attention at first. Just another old-timer trying to relive his glory days. But then he started hitting the bag. His movements were deliberate, controlled. Not fast, not flashy, but precise. Each punch landed exactly where he intended. His footwork was textbook, small steps, balanced stance, never off-center. He wasn't trying to knock the bag off its chain. He was working technique, muscle memory, the fundamentals that most of the younger fighters had never properly learned. That's when the comments started. "Look at Grandpa over there," laughed a guy named Danny, barely 22, with more tattoos than boxing skills. Thinks he still got it. His workout partner, a college kid named Brad who came in twice a week to stay in shape, snickered. Someone should tell him this isn't a retirement home. Frank heard them but didn't react. He'd heard worse from Marines who thought they were tough until he showed them what tough really meant. He just kept working the bag, focusing on his breathing, his form, his rhythm. But the comments got louder. "Yo, old man," Danny called out. "You might want to try the YMCA down the street. They got water aerobics for people your age." A few others laughed. Frank paused, turned slightly, and looked at Danny with calm eyes. "I'm fine here, thanks." "Yeah, but you're taking up space that real fighters could use," Brad added, emboldened by the laughter. "This is a serious gym, not a place for has-beens to pretend they're still warriors." That word, pretend, hung in the air for a moment. Frank set down his gloves, walked over to his duffel bag, and pulled out a water bottle. He took a slow sip, then looked directly at the group of young men who were now fully focused on him. "You boys know what you're doing with those gloves?" he asked quietly. Danny flexed, showing off arms covered in tribal tattoos. "I've been boxing for 3 years, old man. I could teach you a thing or two." Frank nodded thoughtfully. "I'm sure you could." He paused. "Mind if I ask where you learned?" "YouTube, mostly. Some classes here and there." Frank smiled, not mockingly, just sadly. "YouTube, that's something." Brad stepped forward, chest puffed out. "Look, Gramps, we're trying to train here. Why don't you head home before you hurt yourself?" That's when Sal himself walked over. The gym owner, 55 years old and built like a brick wall, had been watching from behind the front desk. He knew Frank, had known him for 15 years, but he also knew his business depended on the younger crowd, the monthly memberships, the kids with money to spend. "Frank," Sal said uncomfortably, "maybe it would be better if you came in during off-peak hours." You know, when it's not so crowded. Frank looked at Sal for a long moment. They'd sparred together back in the day. Sal knew exactly who Frank was, what he'd done, where he'd been. But business was business. "Sure, Sal," Frank said quietly. "I understand." He packed up his gloves, zipped his duffel bag, and walked toward the door. As he passed the group of young fighters, Danny couldn't resist one last comment. "Don't forget your senior discount at McDonald's, Grandpa." The laughter followed Frank out the door and into the parking lot. He sat in his truck for a moment, not angry, not hurt, just tired. Tired of being invisible, tired of a world that had forgotten what respect meant, tired of young men who thought toughness came from attitude instead of earning it in places where attitude got you killed. He pulled out his phone and sent a simple text to a group chat he rarely used anymore. "Anyone free tonight? Could use some backup at Sal's gym on Industrial Drive?" The responses came back immediately. "On my way, Gunny. Be there in 20. Oorah, Sergeant. Time to school some kids. Should I bring the boys from 2nd Battalion?" Exactly 1 hour later, the glass door of Sal's boxing gym opened again. First through the door was Miguel Santos, now 38, wearing a simple black t-shirt that couldn't hide the muscle built over 2 decades of military service. Behind him came David Park, Korean-American, quiet intensity in his eyes. Then came Johnson, then Rodriguez, then Williams. One by one they filed in. Different ages, different backgrounds, but all carrying themselves with the same unmistakable bearing. Straight posture, alert eyes, and the kind of confidence that doesn't need to announce itself. The gym went quiet. Not just quiet, dead silent. The sounds of punching bags and jumping rope faded as everyone turned to watch 12 men spread out through the gym with military precision. They weren't threatening, weren't aggressive. They just moved like men who knew exactly where they were going and what they were doing. Miguel walked directly to Danny, who was still at the same heavy bag where he'd been mocking Frank an hour earlier. He didn't get too close, didn't invade personal space, just positioned himself where Danny couldn't ignore him. "Excuse me," Miguel said politely. "Were you the one giving my former drill instructor a hard time earlier?" Danny's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked around for support, but his friends had suddenly become very interested in their own workouts. "Drill instructor?" Brad managed to stammer from across the gym. David Park answered without taking his eyes off the young men. "Gunnery Sergeant Frank Martinez, 26 years active duty, 3 tours in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan, trained over 3,000 Marines, including all of us. Johnson, a mountain of a man with scars on his arms that told their own stories, added quietly, "He taught us how to fight, how to survive, how to come home." The gym was so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Sal emerged from behind the front desk, his face pale. He knew exactly what was happening and exactly how badly he'd screwed up. Rodriguez, the smallest of the group but somehow the most intimidating, spoke directly to Sal. "Our gunny says you asked him to leave, said it would be better if he came during off-peak hours." Sal's voice cracked slightly. There was a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," Williams said calmly. "Just disrespect to a man who earned the right to train anywhere he wants, anytime he wants." Miguel looked back at Danny, who was now visibly shaking. "You called him Grandpa. You told him to find a senior center." "I didn't know," Danny started. "Know what?" David Park interrupted. "That you should respect your elders, that you should keep your mouth shut when you don't know who you're talking to, that real toughness doesn't come from running your mouth in a gym." Santos stepped closer to the heavy bag Danny had been using. With one quick, precise combination, jab, cross, hook, he demonstrated technique that Danny couldn't achieve in 10 years of YouTube training. The bag barely moved, but the sound of leather hitting leather was crisp, clean, perfect. "This is how Gunny taught us to punch," Santos said quietly. "Want to see what else he taught us?" Danny shook his head quickly. That's when Frank himself walked back through the door. He surveyed the scene, his former Marines spread throughout the gym, The young fighters pressed against the walls, Sal standing behind his desk looking like he wanted to disappear. "At ease," Frank said simply, and immediately his Marines relaxed their postures slightly. Still alert, still ready, but no longer radiating controlled menace. Frank walked to the center of the gym, where everyone could see him. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying easily through the silent space, "I appreciate you coming, but this isn't why I trained you." Miguel started to speak. "Gunny, they disrespected you." Frank held up a hand. "And that's their choice to make and their consequence to live with. We don't demand respect through intimidation. We earn it through action." He looked around the gym, making eye contact with each of the young fighters who had mocked him. These boys think they know what tough looks like. They think it's about attitude, about talking loud, about pushing around old men. They're wrong, but that's not their fault. Nobody ever taught them better. Frank walked over to the heavy bag Danny had been using. Tough is getting up at 4 a.m. for 26 years to train teenagers who think they already know everything. Tough is watching young men you trained get shipped overseas and not all of them come back. Tough is coming home to a country that doesn't always appreciate what you've done and still showing up every day to serve in whatever way you can. He looked directly at Danny. Tough is an old man walking into a gym full of kids who could physically overwhelm him and still conducting himself with dignity when they mock him. That's tough. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Finally, Danny found his voice. "Sir, I'm sorry, I didn't know." Frank nodded. "Now you do. Question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge?" Santos spoke up. "Gunny trained us to fight, but more than that, he trained us to be men. Honor, respect, brotherhood. Maybe these guys would like to learn something real." Frank looked at Sal, who was still pale and obviously struggling with how to handle the situation.
"Sal," Frank said, "I'll be back tomorrow at 6 p.m. If that's a problem, just say so now."
Sal shook his head quickly. "No problem at all, Frank, no problem whatsoever." Frank nodded, then looked at his former Marines. "Thank you for coming, but you don't need to stay. These boys and I are going to have a conversation about respect and what it really means to be tough." One by one, his Marines nodded and began to leave. But before they went, each one stopped to shake hands with Frank. Not casual handshakes, but the firm grip of men who had served together, bled together, and would answer each other's calls for the rest of their lives. Miguel was the last to leave. He paused at the door and looked back at the young fighters who were still standing against the walls. "Gunnery Martinez saved my life in Fallujah," he said quietly. "Carried me out under fire when I took shrapnel in both legs. Never asked for thanks, never told the story, never even wrote it up in his report. Just did his job." He looked directly at Danny. "Next time you think about disrespecting someone, remember that you never know who you're talking to. You never know what they've done, what they've seen, what they've sacrificed. Show respect first, ask questions later." And then he was gone, leaving Frank alone with a gym full of young men who suddenly understood that they had just received a master class in what real strength looked like. Frank picked up his gloves, walked back to the heavy bag, and began hitting it again. Same precise technique, same controlled power, same quiet dignity. One by one, the other fighters resumed their training, but the atmosphere had changed completely. The jokes stopped. The showing off stopped. Even the music seemed quieter. After about 10 minutes, Danny approached Frank hesitantly. "Sir," he said quietly, could you show me how to throw a proper jab? I think I've been doing it wrong." Frank paused, looked at the young man, really looked at him, and nodded. "Sure, son, but first, tell me why you want to learn." Danny thought for a moment. "Because I want to be tough. Really tough, not just pretend tough." Frank smiled. "Good answer. Now, the first thing you need to understand is that real toughness starts here." He tapped his chest. "Everything else is just technique." For the next hour, Frank worked with Danny, then with Brad, then with several other young fighters who had the humility to ask for help. He taught them footwork, breathing, balance,
the fundamentals that YouTube videos couldn't convey and that attitude couldn't replace. Sal watched from behind the desk, occasionally shaking his head at his own stupidity. He'd almost lost the best trainer he'd ever seen because he was worried about offending customers who didn't deserve to be in the same gym. As the evening wound down and the gym began to empty, Sal approached Frank. "Frank," he said, "I owe you an apology. What I did earlier—" Frank waved him off. "Forget it, Sal. You run a business. I understand." "No, you don't understand. What you just did here tonight, the way you handled those kids, the way your guys showed up for you, the lesson you taught about respect, that's worth more than 100 monthly memberships." Frank finished packing his gloves. "Those boys aren't bad kids, Sal. They just needed to learn that there's a difference between being tough and acting tough. Would you consider doing some training classes here? Real training, not just gym membership stuff. Teaching what you taught those Marines." Frank considered it. "Maybe, if there are young men who really want to learn." As Frank headed for the door, Danny caught up with him. "Sergeant Martinez," he said, using the rank respectfully. "Thank you for teaching me tonight. And I'm sorry about earlier." Frank stopped and looked at the young man. "Danny, right?" "Yes, sir." "You apologized. You listened. You learned. That takes character. Keep developing that character and you'll become the kind of tough that really matters." Danny nodded seriously. "Yes, sir, I will." Frank walked out into the parking lot where Miguel was leaning against his truck waiting for him. "Thought you might want some company on the drive home, Gunny." Frank smiled. "I'm fine, Miguel, but thank you. Those kids learn anything tonight. Time will tell, but they had their eyes opened, and that's a start." Miguel nodded. "Same thing you did for us 20 years ago. Opened our eyes to what we could become instead of what we thought we were. You boys became more than I ever imagined you could. I'm proud of all of you." "We know, Gunny. That's why we came tonight. That's why we'll always come." As Frank drove home, he thought about the evening, about disrespect met with dignity, about young men learning the difference between strength and attitude, about brotherhood that lasted decades after the uniforms came off. Some lessons couldn't be taught in classrooms or learned from videos. Some lessons required exactly what had happened tonight. A moment when pretense fell away and real character was revealed. The next evening, Frank arrived at Sal's gym at 6 p.m. sharp. Danny was there waiting for him, along with Brad and 3 other young fighters. They had questions about technique, about training, about what it really meant to be tough. Frank spent 2 hours with them teaching not just boxing but discipline, respect, and the kind of inner strength that couldn't be faked or learned overnight. Word spread quickly. Within a week, Frank was unofficially teaching classes 3 nights a week. Young fighters came not just to learn how to punch, but to learn from a man who had trained warriors, who had earned respect through decades of service, and who taught by example what real toughness looked like. Sal's gym became known throughout the city as the place where you learned more than just boxing. You learned character, you learned respect, you learned what it meant to be a man. And in the corner, at the same heavy bag where he'd been mocked just weeks earlier, Frank Martinez continued his quiet training. Still precise, still controlled, still dignified, but no longer invisible. Some stories end with apologies. Some end with changed hearts. This one ended with young men learning that real warriors don't need to announce themselves. They simply carry themselves with quiet dignity and let their actions speak. And when those actions inspire a dozen former Marines to show up in solidarity, you know you're looking at the kind of man the world needs more of. So now I ask you, have you ever met someone like Gunnery Sergeant Frank Martinez? Someone who was underestimated, disrespected, or overlooked until the right moment revealed who they really were. Someone whose former students, colleagues, or friends would drop everything to stand with them. Share their story in the comments. Tell us about the teachers, mentors, and quiet heroes who shaped lives without seeking recognition. Because here at the Human Stories, we believe that respect isn't just given, It's earned through decades of service, sacrifice, and dignity. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it. Help us honor the men and women who train warriors, who teach character, and who show us that real toughness comes from within. We'll see you in the next story, and until then, remember, you never know who you're talking to. Show respect first, ask questions later. And if you're lucky enough to meet a real warrior, listen carefully. They have more to teach than you could learn in a lifetime.